So what I'm going to ask you to do, and I'm going to be aided by some slides up here, is I'm going to ask you for just these next 10 minutes, perhaps the entire morning, to take all the things you currently think about this condition and your own relationship to it, which may be marginal or may be substantial. And I'm going to ask you just for a few minutes to put it aside and allow me and allow us to tell you perhaps a slightly different version of this story. Is that a deal?
Sure.
All right, good. Well, I'm going to be aided by some images on the screen. The truth of it is it's the great triumph of longevity that brings us here this morning. As many of you know, for thousands and thousands of years, humans dreamed of longer lives. Humans dreamed of the idea of living 80 or 90 years without disease or without having to succumb to something terrible. But it wasn't until the arrival of public health departments at the beginning of the 20th century that we began to see an uptick in longevity. Then, of course, in the 1920s and 30s, the arrival of antibiotics, and now for the first time, our grandparents or great-grandparents could be free of diseases that would otherwise have brought them down. This is a picture, I think, of Dr. Stanley Prusner as a young boy getting his polio vaccine. Many of us can remember or have a faint memory of the early 1950s. Jonas Salk had his incredible breakthrough, 1953, 1955. And now today, most high school kids wouldn't even know what polio is. And I want to throw out one little footnote. I was lucky when I was in my 20s to collaborate on a book with Dr. Salk. And one night at dinner, he told me that in the 1940s, the belief was that poliomyelitis would be running rampant, and there'd be iron lung sanitariums in every community in the country, perhaps the world. But his move, his breakthrough, his team's breakthrough altered that. And one of the questions we're here to discuss is a future of more and more caregiving, more and more dementia, or can we collectively alter that? Justice O'Connor. Breakthroughs in science and pharmacology and modern medicine, and now, and this might sound peculiar, but one of the effects of a century of breakthroughs is that not only do we live longer on average, but there are more and more of us doing so. 2/3 of all the people who have ever lived past 65 in the entire history of the world are alive today. If you take a look with me at this chart, what you see is something quite extraordinary. On the first day of the 20th century, the average life expectation at birth was 47. On the last day, it was 77. That's a bigger vault in one century than in the previous 900 years. And I'm going to click this little device in my hand and show you the average life expectation chart over the past 100,000 years. And here the plot thickens, because medical anthropologists now tell us that around 99% of all the years that humans have walked this earth, the average life expectation was under 18. And so there were always 40 and 60 and 70-year-olds, just not that many. And in the 1850s, couples didn't say, gee, honey, what would you like to do after retirement? Because you'd be dead. Our medical system didn't need to be expert at things like hypercholesterolemia, osteoarthritis, adult onset diabetes, late life dementia, because most people died young of acute infectious diseases, accidents, trauma, childbirth, before they lived long enough to have their bodies or their brains wear out. Second theme that's driving and stirring the pot has to do with that extraordinary moment after World War II. Who would imagine that all that hugging and kissing would be leading to a 21st century pandemic of dementia? Well, most of you are fully aware, so I won't have to go into that much detail, that we went through a period of fertility decline during the centuries leading into the Depression and the war. Birth rate hit an all-time low. But then when the boys came home in 1945, it was a time of great hopefulness. The economy was booming. 92% of all women who could have children, averaging about 3.5 kids per woman. And what you see is that every 8 seconds, about 10,000 a day, 4 million a year, boomers came into the world. Take a look with me at these charts. You may never have seen charts quite like these. What I did was I went back to the 1950s and carved the US demographic data by each demographic segment and charted which groups grew or declined relative to itself. So if you look at the 1950s, it was clearly a time of enormous growth of children. 1960s, the growth had changed. 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. This is the decade we're currently coming out of. But the 20-year spread is when the story gets interesting. This is how America is reconfiguring demographically during the period 2000 to 2020. And this is totally predictable. There is no population or marketplace or demographic force more predictable than this age wave. And I suppose the grand question is, are we ready? Have we thought about it? What happens to our pensions? What happens to the talent that older people have? What are all the possibilities for adult education, for personal reinvention? What becomes a retirement when we have tens and tens of millions of people flooding into this stage of life? And just as what happened in 1946, beginning in a few months, January 1st of 2011, every 8 seconds another boomer will be turning 65. 10,000 a year, 4 million, 10,000 a day, 4 million a year for 18 straight years. And so the fuse has been lit. Third, I was trying to think of a reasonable metaphor for what we're in the middle of here. And there's this terribly peculiar irony, for those of you who like science fiction, it stands right up there, which is that the extraordinary breakthroughs in the 20th century are now giving us more and more older people. They're having health conditions that our medical system is not prepared to handle. So there's a myth of a beautiful goddess Eos. It's a Greek myth. And as fate would have it, she falls in love with a warrior named Tithonus when she goes to Zeus and begs Zeus to grant him immortality. And Zeus says, fine. But as she's leaving Zeus's chamber, she realizes she forgot to ask for health. So as the fable goes, this once proud warrior grows older and sicker, and his bones break, and his organs rot, and his brain becomes demented, but he can't die. That's what we've created with our modern healthcare system. These are the chart of the various conditions that are likely to rise up with an aging body, and I apologize to our front panel here. They're probably wondering what they all might be. But I'm not here to ruin your morning, except to say that more and more of these conditions have to do with the functioning of the brain, an area in which we have only beginning knowledge. And if you look at the 85 and over population, the dementia rate is now 47%. That's 1 in 2. And I want to be very clear about this. 1 in 2. And it's not just uneducated people. It's educated people. It's not poor people. It's rich people. It's not weak people. It's presidents of countries. That what this means is that as we live longer and longer, 1 in 2 of us will have dementia. You or your spouse. You or your mom or your dad, maybe both of them. 1 in 2. You can think of no disease more pervasive in any stage of life than this one. And this is where we're headed. So take any group of people, like this group right here. You can wipe out half of their minds in the years to come. Half of your minds. And this is the part that I think the boomers are just beginning to realize, that dementia is not that thing out there for somebody else. This is mom, this is dad, this is my brother, this is me. And, as fate would have it, the fastest growing segment of our population are people over the age of 85. So I was trying to think of a reasonable analogy here. And when Katrina rolled into the Gulf Coast, we could see it. You could see it on radar screens. You could see it from the sky. And yet we didn't quite prepare. And its effect was horrendous. So what's the comparison? Well, dementia would be not something twice the size of Katrina relative to our landmass. It would be 5 times the size of Katrina relative to our landmass. And I don't want to become overly dramatic this morning, except I think we must be. This is what is coming. And we can either choose to do absolutely nothing about it and pretend it's not coming, but it will still come. Or we can do our best to avert it. We can wipe out polio so that we don't need iron lung sanitariums. If you look at the world map, for each doctor there's 100,000 cases of Alzheimer's. This was 1900, this was 1950, this was 2000, and this is where we're heading. A world besieged by dementia. If somebody might ask the folks, excuse me, if you could ask the folks doing the cleaning up now if they might hold that just for a couple of hours. I'd also like to point out that this particular disease is 100% incurable currently and 100% fatal. You do not get better from it. You don't sneak away from it. You don't get lucky when you get your Alzheimer's diagnostic to somehow be able to buy your way through it. 100%. A moment ago, George mentioned the annual costs, but the cumulative costs are really quite extraordinary. If you add up the cost between now and the year 2050, $20 trillion will be spent in the United States looking after this people with this disease. $20 trillion. I would tell you, by the way, that if some horrendous enemy of ours, somehow amassed a weapon of mass destruction. And the way it worked was that it got inside your brain and it rotted it. And it caused you to forget who you were. And it caused you to be unable to control your own body flow and your bowel movements. And it caused your family to have to break down their own patterns to care for you. We would wage a war against it with everything we had. It would be seen as the most horrendous attack on our population imaginable. We have 5 million people today. It's projected that by the time my generation gets into their 80s, it'll be somewhere between 13 and 15 million. And the effect of the disease is not simply on the individual. It's on my wife. It's on my children. It's on my brother. It's on the neighbors. It's on the place that I work. It's on the economy. And so from where I sit, and people know I've been in this field now for 37 years, and I largely am the guy that talks about all the wonderful things that come with the age wave. Time for reinvention, time to continue being productive, to write your first book of poems, to learn how to run a marathon when you're 80, to go to up in space when you're 77 if you're John Glenn. But I will tell you from where I sit, and I don't say this lightly, I believe there is not one single circumstance more potentially horrendous with regard to the aging of the world's population than the pandemics of dementia that are about to hit us. Unless we can rise up, take it seriously, put the resources, intelligence, leadership, and attention against this disease, and stop it.